Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up later in the show, we'll visit Fort St. Charles on the northwest angle of Minnesota. But first, Matt Olien got a chance to sit down with our guest for this week.
And my guest today is the remarkable poet, author, and watercolor painter, Bro Helf from Bismarck. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
First off, Bro, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're from originally.
I'm originally from Dallas, Texas. I lived in a number of parts of the country as well as abroad. But I first came to North Dakota 28 years ago, supposedly to take a trip out to Oregon following the Lewis and Clark route. I was going to stay in Bismarck 3 days and then drive on, and I fell in love with Bismarck. I kept delaying my departure, and I never left for the whole vacation. Came back the next year. The year after that, rented a house, and then finally bought a house in Bismarck, and I have yet to make the driving trip out from Bismarck to Oregon.
Well, we're glad you stayed and have contributed so much great art. Let's talk about a couple of your books that you're here to talk about. North Dakota Days is the first one. Tell us about that.
Well, I wanted to try to capture the life of small towns, especially in North Dakota, and also the beautiful landscapes, because North Dakota has such an infinite sense in the land. It is like an ocean. The prairie is so beautiful, and so I wanted to try to capture that as much as I could in my watercolors.
Mm-hmm. You know, some people, I think maybe people who've lived here a long time, might see the state as sometimes boring because there's not a lot of hills until you get to Medora and you know, Teddy Roosevelt National Park. But what is it that inspired you? Is it just that you can see the vast landscape, or what was it that triggered you to stay in Bismarck?
Well, I think the two things that mattered the most to me were, number one, the friendliness of the people. I've lived in many places, and North Dakota is the friendliest place on earth, in my opinion. The other is the landscapes are varied. The colors are beautiful. And in North Dakota, you always feel that you're almost at the top of the world looking out towards an infinite space. And so I see the land as incredibly varied and beautiful. It's never struck me as monotone or boring.
Where do you find the, you know, in the book we're seeing as we're talking here, some great watercolors that you've painted. Where do you get the inspiration for those? I assume it's traveling around, but then how do you determine I'm going to paint this and put this in the book?
Well, usually I look for either landscapes or old buildings that especially appeal to me. And sometimes I'll take photographs and then do the painting later. Sometimes I will paint right there on the scene. And often that is very rewarding because people come and talk to you. I'll never forget once in Hazleton, I was doing a picture of an old blue house, and a very elderly lady walked up to me and asked what I was doing. I explained, and she said, well, I have a restaurant in the center of town. It's just closed, and I ran it for 54 years. And I said, well, I would love to paint that. And she said, too late. The bulldozers knocked it down today. And I said, well, I feel so bad. And she said, I don't. I ran it for 10 years too long. So it's just the people reach out to you here and make you feel warm. And so often it's not just the scenes, it's the people who talk to me or who introduce me to different landscapes and buildings.
And go back to when you started out as a younger man, what came first, the writing or the watercolors, or how did that all come about?
Writing.
Okay.
I studied, did my graduate work at Johns Hopkins University in the creative writing seminars, and I started writing professionally in the early 80s. But then when I moved to LA in the mid 80s, I started to study watercolors, and I started to paint, and then eventually put the two together.
What is more difficult? Are the watercolors more difficult because you started out as a writer, or how do you find that?
They're both equally difficult, and all I can say is, number one, it takes a lot of practice for either one. I remember a songwriter was once asked, how long did it take you to write this song? And he said 5 minutes and 20 years. And it takes a long time to get good at writing and a long time to get good at painting.
Mm-hmm. What's been the reaction to this book?
Well, I
after
think
it's
it's been
released?
very good. We have a show of many of the original watercolors at Gallery 522 in Bismarck now, and people seem to enjoy the books. And it was very touching to me. We had a reception there about 2 weeks ago, and one lady came out of the exhibit and said, "You've given me new hope and new faith in North Dakota." And since North Dakota has given me so much hope and faith, that was very touching to me.
Yeah, that brings a follow-up question I hadn't thought of, and that is, do you find that you, like that lady said, give people a different way to look at their state? As I mentioned, if you've lived here all your life, you may not notice that building on the corner of town, and then all of a sudden you bring it to life.
Well, I hope so. The beauty is there, and there's very seldom, even the smallest town that I visit, where I don't find beauty. But I hope that when people see them as I paint them, the buildings or the landscapes, they recognize the beauty. And I often say that I reconstruct buildings. I love taking old churches that have been abandoned, or old schools, old buildings, and restoring them. It's almost like I'm rebuilding them with my painting. I raise the flag again above the school. I repair the windows. I try to restore the original spirit of the building.
Can you read a poem for us?
Surely, thank you. I thought I would read a poem that reflects this season, since fall is so beautiful here. It's called Raising a Ruckus. Yellow-leafed cottonwoods know better than to trust a warm September breeze. Already changed for fall, they listen to their own voices, root deep and winter taught, insisting on a mighty bonfire in the face of cool-eyed blue skies.
A short one.
Yeah. Oh.
And you love fall, right?
Yes, yes. Fall is incredibly beautiful here.
Yeah. When you write a poem, how do you know when it's done? Now that's a short one. You have some others that are longer. Painters have been asked this too. When is the painting done? And they're never quite sure. How do you arrive at that?
It is very hard to tell, but with poetry, I'd say it's easier. Somehow, a poem is sort of like a rubber band of the mind. It is something where it stretches out, and then at the end, it snaps back, and the mind says, yes, that's complete. So I just have a feeling usually that I have wrapped up what I wanted to say. Paintings are much more difficult because you always want to add something or change something. Luckily with watercolors, you can't change much because the paper absorbs the paint, and so you have to be spontaneous. And if you go back and say, well, I want to add some color over that, too bad. You can try, but it usually won't work.
And when you paint, Bro, is it kind of a representation of the building? Do you try to be more impressionistic in your work? The way I'm seeing it anyway, it looks like that.
Well, I tried, it's representational in that I want people to be able to recognize it and enjoy the details. But more than anything, I ask myself when I finish, did you capture the spirit of this landscape or this building, this scene? Did you capture, the spirit? And I look again at it and say either yes or no. Sometimes you say no, and then you move on to another painting.
Mm-hmm. Have you been back to some of the towns and the buildings that you've painted and gotten reaction from people? You talk about them coming to Gallery 522,
many. I go back to
tell
many
us
of
about
the
that.
towns again and again, and you usually don't meet the same people, but you meet different people, and it's always rewarding. I was out in Carson about 3 weeks ago doing a painting, and I tried to find out the name of an old church that had been abandoned, and I couldn't find it. So I drove back out there day before yesterday. I still couldn't find the name, but going back to that church after I'd painted, I felt as if I were revisiting a friend. It was wonderful. It was very touching to me.
Okay, North Dakota Travels, which kind of similar book came out about the same time. Tell us about that one.
Well, I wanted to go from region to region. North Dakota is so diverse, and so I wanted to capture different parts of the state. And then I also wanted to capture different seasons towards the end of the book, because once again, there's tremendous diversity. So even though the themes are similar, I think that it is it is geared more towards traveling around the state and enjoying different seasons.
Has COVID affected your travels at all in terms of painting and things like that? Or tell me about how that's affected you in your work and your life.
Not really, because I usually drive alone out into the country, and I mean, if someone comes along and we talk, I use a mask. But both painting and writing are pretty much solitary arts, so it hasn't affected it that much.
You talk about the change of seasons quite a bit. Now, growing up in Dallas, you don't experience that quite as much as you do here. What is it you like about the change of seasons? And had you experienced it really, you probably hadn't experienced it like this until you left Dallas.
Well, I had experienced it. I lived in New England for a while, and I lived in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. And so I had experienced it, but it is so dramatic here in North Dakota. I mean, all of a sudden the trees just change, and you can have a warm, balmy day, and the next day it can be 40 degrees cooler, and the sky has that deep, deep blue. So I'd never experienced that rapid a change in climate.
And in winters, you live where?
I live in Hawaii.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm a snowbird.
That's okay. Have you ever been in Bismarck during some winter months, and tell me what is that like for you?
I have been in Bismarck during the winter, and it's very cold and a shock. I remember one day when I was going out with friends, and they'd invited me to a party, and it was -5 was the real temperature. With the wind chill was probably -30. And I met a friend on the way, and she was driving, I was driving, and she rolled down her window, and I said, "This is unbelievable." I just couldn't believe I was there. But I went on to the party, and it was some of the most fun I've ever had. So North Dakotans cope with the wet winter rather well.
Have you ever done an outdoor painting during the middle of winter in
No,
North Dakota? No,
you
haven't gone that far yet.
No, I'm
Okay.
afraid my hands would freeze up.
Okay. What's been the reaction to this book? Similar to North Dakota Days, or slightly different, or
Well, I
what?
think about the same. Many people buy both of them because they are companion volumes, but I think it's been very similar.
And what do you do first, bro, when you're out looking at a town or whatever? Does the art come first? Does the poem come first? Do you want to write about what you're seeing first? Can you take us through your work process?
They come separately. The poetry is inspired by a scene or an event or people, and it is inspired solely by that. The paintings are inspired by a scene or a building, and sometimes I will write a poem about the same scene that I painted, but very often I simply match a poem that seems to go well with the painting. But I don't try to make one. I try to make each one stand on its own. The poem or the prose writing and the painting.
Who were you influenced by as a younger man as a writer in your
I
writing?
would say Virginia Woolf,
Okay.
and more than anyone else, Willa Cather, who writes about the prairie of Nebraska, but it's very similar in a way, the feel of it, to North Dakota.
And how about your watercolors? That
Well,
came later in life. What were you influenced by there?
I think the American regionalists of the 1920s through 40s, especially, also expressionist painters, and somewhat Japanese painting.
And tell us about your exhibit, which is currently up at Gallery 522 in Bismarck. Tell us about what the exhibit's called and what people can see there.
Well, it's called North Dakota Visions, and we have 29 works there. Some of them are works that are shown in the book. Some of them are more recent works. And we've tried to sort of arrange them thematically so that you have some old buildings from small towns and then a lot of landscapes too.
Did you have a big opening there, and what was that like?
Yes, we did as much as COVID could allow, and in order not to press people in too closely, I was up on the sidewalk at a table, and then people would come say hello and then go down into the gallery. But it was wonderful in a way, because in the midst of this, I was sitting there, and there was the ladies who had organized it had put 2 artificial bushes on either side of me. And some people walked by, a man and his little children, and he said, well, we live right up the block. And because there's a comic store in the same building as the gallery, we thought this was a costume party with comic characters and that you were coming as a tree.
Did he buy anything?
Yeah, no,
Okay, but it was
no,
still a good
no.
encounter. So how do people buy your artwork? It's for sale, obviously. Tell us about that
Well,
process.
it's for sale at Gallery 522 and also online at simplergifts.com. That's my publishing firm. And the books can be purchased in a lot of bookstores and at Amazon, of course.
But if someone wants to buy your artwork, typically the website's the best place to go, or can they contact someone else? Or
The best place would be, we have several hundred of the original artworks on the website, simplergifts.com, because I have a gallery in San Diego,
Right.
and that's also represented on the website.
that's my next question: is how this gallery in San Diego got started? What's your connection out there, and how did that get started, and what is that like?
Well, when I moved from Los Angeles to San Diego in the mid '80s, and I established the gallery there shortly thereafter. And I had already published some limited edition artworks, but I started to produce original artworks, and I wanted a gallery. So I've run it there in San Diego ever since.
And do you have other artists that?
No, I'm afraid
You're the guy.
I'm it.
Okay, and that's been successful for you.
Yes, it's been a wonderful experience. It really has.
And how about the publishing house in San Diego?
Well,
what does that do?
I had started earlier with visual poetry, sometimes called concrete poetry, which is shaped poetry. And I started to do limited edition books of that. And then when I did more and more paintings, I thought, well, why not publish books that combine the paintings with the poetry? So ever since the mid '80s, I've done that. And some of my books have been published by other publishers, but I still like the control of publishing my own books, because trying to get the colors right, exactly right, is very difficult.
Now you talk about your other books. What are some of the other books you've written, and what are they about?
Well, the one published by Mellon Poetry Press was Seasonal Delights. It was a group of pen and ink drawings and of the different seasons, and then poetry that went with it. Right now, I'm about to come out with 2 more books about San Diego.
Okay.
And they also are watercolors and poetry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So if you have a similar kind of style, similar kind of book in San Diego, obviously different terrain there, different buildings, very old buildings. What's that like compared to like painting in North Dakota?
Well, I mean, San Diego, I lived there for 20 years before moving to Hawaii, and I enjoyed it a great deal. But it is very different from North Dakota, because in San Diego, you have the ocean, and that gives you a sense of the infinite. But I never felt there the expansiveness of the soul and of the land that you feel in North Dakota. So even though I still love San Diego, North Dakota is my spiritual home.
I suppose that old Spanish architecture, though, that can be pretty interesting. Have you attempted that?
Yes. I've painted a number of paintings of old buildings in San Diego and the environs.
I know in the foreword of one of your books, you talk about kind of the central theme of your life and your poetry. Can you put that into words?
Well, I think
is?
that the central theme would be optimism and faith in people. And that's one thing that North Dakota taught me very greatly. I always say to people, North Dakota is the only place I know of where you can feel down in the dumps in the morning and go out and do 5 errands, which you have to do, and in most places would irritate you, and you come back feeling elated, because so many people have made you feel better about life, have been kind to you, or have talked to you. People in North Dakota love interacting with other people. They're not so obsessed with things or entertainment. Other people are precious to them. And so I think that hope and optimism that North Dakotans have imparted to me is important. And also the joy of everyday living. I know of no place where people take more joy in just the everyday routine of living.
Mm-hmm. Can you read, we have like 2 minutes left, one more poem, or if there's 2 short ones, something like that, or a long one?
This one is short also.
Okay.
So, and also it's about autumn. I'll tell you just a little
Okay.
about it, which
Yep.
is that for years and years, Jeff Franco, a Lutheran minister, lived next to me in Bismarck. And he was south of my house. And so I noticed that whenever the wind came up in the fall, all of my leaves blew over in his lawn. And I always thought he would be angry. He never was. So this poem is called Secondhand Blessings. The wind has given my minister neighbor my autumn leaves, the gold and the glory and the burden of collecting his windfall. Standing above the fiery-eyed carpet, he leans upon his rake and sighs, then smiling, lifts up his voice in a mighty hymn of praise. And I don't know if he ever lifted up his voice in a hymn of praise while raking leaves, but his spirit
Right.
Conveyed that sense of joy.
We're just almost to wrap up on time. Again, if people want to buy your books or your artwork, where do they go? Who do they contact?
Well, the easiest way is to go to simplergifts.com. That's GIFTS.com. Or Amazon has the books. Or if you're in Bismarck, go to Gallery 522. The books and the paintings are there.
Okay. Bro, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
My guest has been Bro Helf, a phenomenal watercolor painter and author from living in Bismarck part of the time, not during the winter though. Stay tuned for more.
Fort St. Charles in Lake of the Woods County in Minnesota was established in 1732 during a time of trade and exploration west. In recent years, local Northwest Angle residents have been instrumental in the reconstruction of the fort.
You can hardly overemphasize the importance of this. It's just a great history, and not just Minnesota history, it's Canadian history, it's Western history, it's the history of travel and exploration.
At that particular time, ships, if they wanted to go to the Orient, had to go all the way around the tip of Africa or the tip of South America, making a journey to the Orient 3, sometimes even up to 4 years. There was this perpetual hope that they could find a Northwest Passage, some way to get across North America.
Almost all of that begins with the travel and exploration of a single family.
Pierre La Vérendrye is a soldier for the king, Louis XIV and Louis XV, and he and his sons and nephews take off across the Great Lakes.
Most of those trips were done without government financing. At the very, very tip of the Northwest Angle, he built a fort, Fort St. Charles.
At Fort St. Charles, they're trading with the Assiniboine, they're trading with the Cree, they're trading with various bands of the Sioux.
It was kind of a point where they would go off and build other forts. So there were about 9, 10 forts farther west and farther north of Fort St. Charles. One of the important historical things, or what people get excited about on Lake of the Woods, is the story about Massacre Island. And that was one of La Vérendrye's sons, and 19 voyageurs and a priest, Father Alnou, were going east to meet a resupply team, and they were all killed.
The bodies of the priest and La Vérendrye the younger are left whole, but the voyageurs, the 19 voyageurs, are actually beheaded.
This wasn't an insignificant event. It was, the French called them Sioux. They were Dakota that killed all these voyageurs and traders. That began a war between the Dakota and Ojibwe that lasted a long, long time.
The elder La Vérendrye has his son's body, the body of the priest, brought back, as well as the heads of the individuals retrieved from Massacre Island and taken to Fort St. Charles. La Vérendrye the elder keeps moving west to try to find the Northwest Passage, and at some point the bodies are essentially forgotten about. As the water changes, as the tides go in and out, the spot is actually lost. The Fort St. Charles essentially collapses. Around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the priest family finds a cache of letters. And in the cache of letters, it becomes more clear where the priest is buried. And then it's in the 20th century that there's a massive effort to find the priest. They finally discover 2 skeletons, and they're pretty dang well certain that they belong to the priest and Jean-Baptiste Le Vérendrye. Some of the 19 skulls, not all of the 19 skulls, are recovered.
Just kind of excites the imagination of historians mostly. And Fort St. Charles, that was a big thing when it was rediscovered, and recreating that fort was a pretty big deal. Ownership of that land was a big deal. It had changed hands many, many times before it was finally given to the state of Minnesota.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Post this week. As always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.